Everyone can hear me? Great. Okay, so hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a new proposed fault-tolerant implementation of the exponential swap, or eSWAP gate. And then I'll talk about a couple of interesting applications to the Chuang-Liang-Yamamoto code, which Ivari will talk about in more depth in his subsequent talk. So the eSWAP gate is a universal entangling operation between two bosonic logical qubits that works irrespective of their particular bosonic encoding. So there can be any superposition of Fock states in either cavity A or cavity B, and it works regardless. So eSWAP is defined as follows, where swap, as you would imagine, describes the complete exchange of states between two cavities, and theta is an ancilla control angle that allows for full tunability of the operation. So whereas it's noteworthy to mention, whereas swap is not an entangling operation, a coherent superposition of identity and swap can be an entangling operation. So this can be a very useful tool for bosonic quantum error correction. Okay, so I think one really nice physically intuitive way to think about eSWAP is as a Mach-Zehnder interferometer. So you can imagine the beam splitters forming either arm of the interferometer. So you can imagine if you have two adjacent 50-50 balanced beam splitters, that is an effective identity operation. If instead you sandwich a parity operator on the B arm of the interferometer, that applies a pi phase shift to the odd photon states, reverses the interference pattern, and produces an effective swap. And then if you want to get a coherent superposition of identity and parity, as you can imagine, you have to exponentiate parity. So you exponentiate parity on the B arm, you sandwich it between these two beam splitters, and that gives you an effective exponential swap operation. So then really the question then becomes, at the hardware level, how do we realize this exponentiated parity? And one option is via this textbook exponentiation gadget. This was proposed by others, but most recently by Gao et al. And essentially the idea is that you use an ancilla and a controlled parity operation to entangle the ancilla, perform an X rotation, and then disentangle the ancilla. And that gives you the exponentiated parity operation. As you can imagine, there are a couple of potential issues with this. The first being that it's not a particularly compact operation. So it requires 5 gates and 3 of them being unique gates. The other and the far more important issue is that this is not fault tolerant to ancilla errors. So at any point during the 5-gate sequence, you could experience ancilla dephasing or decay, and you wouldn't necessarily know what had happened. So in this presentation, we propose the replacement of the entirety of the 5-gate exponentiation gadget with a singular snap gate. So the way snap works, for those who may not know, is that essentially there is a drive on the ancilla that takes the ancilla from, in the case of a 2-level qubit, from G to E and then from E back to G. So essentially one way of thinking about it is that you have a Berry phase that's created by the trajectory of the qubit, and then that Berry phase is kicked back onto the cavity. So there can be unique phases for different Fock states in the cavity. So the nice thing about the snap configuration is that you can manipulate the drives such that e to the I theta is applied to the even Fock states, and e to the minus I theta is applied to the odd Fock states, which you'll notice is exactly our desired exponentiated parity operation. So we can completely replace this sort of bulky 5-gate exponentiation gadget with a singular snap operation. So while it's nice to make this operation more compact, as I had mentioned, the far more meaningful part or advantage of this replacement is the fault-tolerant properties. So we can use extant technology from Reinhold et al. They proposed a fault-tolerant snap gate roughly 6 years ago, I think at this point, that takes advantage of a 3-level GEF ancilla qubit, where the E level of the qubit is reserved exclusively as an error flag state, so it is never intentionally populated. So we drive the ancilla through a Raman transition from G to F, it then acquires a phase, and then back from F to G. So ideally, at the end of the operation, the ancilla qubit is back in G, it's disentangled from the cavity, and the correct operation, in this case, e to the I theta parity based on the parity in the B cavity, is correctly applied. So the nice thing about this technology that we heavily rely upon in this fault-tolerant implementation of eSWAP is that a measurement of the ancilla following the snap gate unambiguously tells you what happened during the operation. So if you measure G at the end of the operation, you know that there was no error, that there was a complete traversing of the qubit of the snap without any errors, and that the desired operation was successfully applied. You know that if you measure E instead, that there was an ancilla relaxation error. But the really neat thing about this technology is that despite having decayed from F to E, we know that in order for the ancilla to have gotten to E, it needs to have passed through F first. So that means despite the fact that the ancilla experienced a decay from F to E, that there was still the successful application of the desired phase. And then finally, if we measure the ancilla to be in F at the conclusion of the operation, we can conclude that there was ancilla dephasing. And so in order to make dephasing effectively apply an identity operation, we make it such that we're driving all of the photon number states in the logical subspace at the same rate omega, such that the path independence conditions are satisfied. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into that, but essentially what that means is that if we measure F, we know that dephasing occurred, but we are able to reset the gate and reapply it until we get a successful outcome. So the sort of marvelous thing about this technology is that it makes snap fault tolerant to ancilla errors, and in turn we can sort of reap the benefits of this technology to make exponential swap operations fault tolerant as well. So I want to take a step back here and talk about some of our motivation for exploring this technology. So the eSWAP has a couple of really useful applications in the context of this Bosonic code that you'll hear about more in a moment, both in terms of state preparation and error correction protocol. So CLY, and the code words are on the upper left-hand side, or upper right-hand side rather, is much like dual rail in that it's a two-mode Bosonic code, but it's unlike dual rail in that it doesn't require concatenation with an outer code like the surface code in order to enable direct correction of single photon loss errors. So it is natively both error detectable and error correctable. And the nice thing is also in comparison to its counterpart Bosonic code, the binomial code, is that given equivalent cavity decay rates, you do not suffer from no jump back action error. So it has a couple of interesting advantages over some of its counterpart Bosonic codes. So the two code words, as I just showed a moment ago, for CLY are 22 and 04 plus 40 over root 2. 22, as you can imagine, it's somewhat easier to prepare that state, whereas with 04 plus 40, the zero logical code word, that is somewhat more difficult. So really the only way to realize this zero logical code word is to take an input 4004, apply eSWAP evaluated at a certain angle. This gives you exactly what you want with the addition of an unwanted relative phase between the two terms that you can then remedy with a cavity rotation. So that then gives you exactly what you want, which is your zero logical state. And then interestingly, you can also use eSWAP to facilitate error correction. So I'd mentioned that one of the nice things about CLY is that it's natively error detectable and error correctable. So if you start off in a superposition of the two logical code words, and then you experience a photon loss in cavity A, you can then measure the state or do a parity measurement on the state. And if we're assuming at most single photon loss errors and you measure odd parity in the A cavity, you can then deduce that there was single photon loss error. You can then perform selective photon addition, followed by exponential swap and a cavity rotation, much like I had just shown you for state preparation. It's actually exactly the same operation instead of angles. So in addition to being really not just useful, but required for state preparation in the CLY code, it's also very useful in the context of correcting single photon loss errors. Great, and I'll point you to a couple of really interesting papers that sort of formed the basis of this research. And I'll also say that one of the really nice qualities of the eSWAP gate is that due to its universality, it's not relegated to just bosonic codes in the superconducting scheme. It's also useful in any hybrid qubit oscillator system like trapped ions. So this is really, eSWAP in general is very useful, but it's also having a fault-tolerant implementation is particularly useful as well. Thank you.